Welcome to Location Matters, a podcast by NGIS, where we explore impactful stories through the lens of geospatial technology.
Picture a factory. Now picture a nature reserve. Most of us wouldn't put those two things together in the same sentence, let alone in the same map. But what if industrial sites are actually meaningful habitats for local wildlife? And what if the technology to make that happen already existed? Today, I'm joined by Aditi Kale from Google, who leads their sustainability program and has compiled a case study from the industrialised Red River Delta area of northern Vietnam, which shows how small interventions from businesses can directly benefit local biodiversity. This proves how business and sustainability do not have to always be in conflict. In fact, they can work together. Welcome, Aditi. For those listeners who don't know about your work, can you share a little bit about yourself, a bit about your background, and what you're doing at Google today?
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to join you and talk about this great work that means so much to me. So in general, I've been at Google over 15 years, although it doesn't feel like that, because we've been able to transfer between different roles, different teams. I've had exposure to operations, digital products across the company. And basically when I started, I joined a team that existed before Google Play. So it was called Android Market at the time, and doing music and app support. But prior to Google, I was in the national security sector, so completely different work. I've had a very circuitous journey to sustainability, but have been fortunate enough to work on sustainability full-time for a few number of years now. So my division of the company is the Consumer Electronics Division. So we handle sustainability strategy for the Pixel products, Nest products, Fitbit products, as well as the platforms like Android OS, Chrome OS, Google Play, Google Photos, things like that. So environmental as well as social responsibility. And in the environmental space, we recently, a few years ago, started the nature and biodiversity pillar. So that's my main focus, especially in the supply chain context.
Amazing. So how have you come to work with NGIS on the Tracemark project through the biodiversity?
A few years ago, when we first started looking into this, it was mainly due to the EU regulations that we knew were coming down and were going to specify measuring and reporting on the biodiversity impact. And so NGIS was a cloud-ready sustainability partner, and one of my colleagues on sustainability teams in cloud, because we work with each other, the sister sustainability teams, we collaborate, and she basically pointed me to NGIS as one of the leaders in the space for the EUDR regulation prep. So we started working on that initially just for compliance reasons, we had to figure out something to do for the regulations coming down. So it's kind of like, okay, what's the bare minimum? I had no background in biology or ecology or anything like that. I'm a supply chain person. And so I was like, okay, what do we need to do here? And fortunately, the experts at NGIS, so I was connected with Nathan Eaton, Damian O'Grady, who are so impressive in their knowledge of all the metrics and how things can be combined, especially since these regulations are constantly changing. Any time I checked, it was something new was happening, and I was like, oh my goodness, how are we gonna do this? But fortunately, they had the expertise to understand what is possible with the data now, and how to build a structure that can evolve even if the regulations change. So we worked together to augment the existing metrics. I said, okay, this is what's needed for a supply chain context. They went out and did the research and figured out the right data sets and how to combine them, because if you can think about it, there's so many data sets that measure biodiversity metrics or system services metrics, and to do it at a granular scale when you have large data sets at a national level, you have to know how to combine them. So they created a methodology where you could choose your weights, choose which metrics are most important for your context, and this is a fairly strong approach, regardless of what happens on the regulatory side. I think we'll be able to adapt. Yeah.
So had you used Google Earth Engine much in other projects before?
So for some projects, again, related to regulatory requirements, but not in so much detail, and definitely not combining the variety of data sets. like from water to species
Yeah.
to soil to,
Yeah,
to
incredible. Yeah.
it was incredible the work that NGIS did to put this together, along with our ecology partners at Second Nature Ecology and Design. So we all work together.
Bringing it all together. You mentioned the EUDR. Can you expand a little bit more about those regulatory requirements?
Yeah, there are a couple that relate to biodiversity and ecosystem services measurement. So I mentioned EUDR, which is the EU Deforestation Related Regulation. So we have to make sure in our entire supply chain we're not contributing to deforestation in any area, no matter where we source our paper, for example, that's used in the packaging for our devices. We have to make sure that it's not from areas that are contributing to deforestation. So that's the EUDR. But there's other ones like the CSDDD, CSRD. I can keep going on. It's an alphabet soup. But effectively, we're seeing similar to how there are a lot of regulations around carbon emissions. We saw that as these new regulations were including biodiversity and ecosystem services, we saw, okay, the trend is that reporting on biodiversity and nature will be more and more important. And it's better to get started now versus wait until it's a requirement, just so we understand the space and know what we could possibly do. And that's yielded some really interesting insights. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. It's good when regulation, you can see, a lot of the time you think, oh, there's more rules and stuff, but in this particular case, it sounds like it's producing some really good outcomes.
Yeah.
And making us sort of look at things that we weren't looking at before.
Yeah, Nick, I can tell you, even though it's not a regulation yet, all of the regulations I mentioned have been pushed out because they're still finalizing. It's super complex. But but even though it's not a requirement yet, we've actually started to take action on the ground at factory sites in our supply chain. And our partners are interested and willing to do these, even if it's not a regulatory requirement. And we've seen interest from other companies who want to learn more as well. Because I think the point of these regulations isn't to just, fill out a form and check a box. It's to do something about any negative impacts you find.
Well, I think, as a species living on this planet, we naturally are interested in this sort of topic and preserving what we've got here already. So, I think it connects with a lot of people. So you mentioned the EUDR and a number of other regulatory requirements were pushed back a little bit. I suppose the reason it was pushed back was people feel like it's very difficult to get started. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I'd say that it's complex, but I'd say that eventually supply chain and businesses will have to pay attention to this, either because it will be a regulatory requirement or it will be something that the local community demands. So I'd say that if you know you have to do it anyways, get started now while the stakes are relatively low. You can learn a lot along this journey and figure out what approach might make sense for you. I'd say in our experience, we thought it'd be much harder than it turned out to be, in that, we had experts like NGIS kind of help us with the geospatial angle, as well as understanding what's possible on the ground with the help of urban ecologists experts. I think the actual mitigation activity that we ended up doing is very simple and straightforward and low cost and scalable. And even that small action leads to pretty large species response. So it's kind of we thought it'd be a big problem, it'd be really hard, we didn't really want to think about it. But the more we learned about it, it's actually not hard, easy, scalable, affordable, especially to do small actions. Anybody can get started even today.
Yeah, it could be a quick, easy win, but there's a few factors you need to look into. But certainly with the work that Aditi's done, I reckon you could at least get started.
Yeah.
Definitely look into it. So you've been working at the intersection of technology and sustainability at Google for some time now. What originally drew you to the space?
Well, to be honest, I had no background in this. I was a supply chain person. I worked on sustainability
and
topics.
Security.
Yeah, security, yeah. So in that sense, I think I love learning about new things, and this was a puzzle, right? We knew that ecosystem services could potentially mitigate harms. For example, if I knew wetlands, if you have more wetlands, if there's a storm or flood happening, the impact of how severe the flood or hurricane would be at a particular location would be less if there's wetland in the area, for example. So I knew vaguely of that, but to see it come to life in these platforms that we built, like on Tracemark, for example, to see how more biodiverse areas have fewer red flags or higher risk scores than the less biodiverse areas. It's like completely clear that if you want to manage risk, which I was interested in as a supply chain person, we very much should pay attention to nature and ecosystem and how much it can reduce that risk, especially given the price tags of, the high impacts that we see. Investing a little bit in nature and taking action early before things get too bad is much cheaper from a business perspective than the opposite.
So in supply chain, what are some of the examples of the key risk factors that would then, be, I guess, mitigated by biodiversity indicators?
Yeah, so generally we try to cover a whole gamut of metrics in the Tracemark platform that we created. We intentionally didn't choose any particular ones to float to the top, because even if they might be interesting to us from a consumer electronics industry perspective, we wanted this platform to be useful for even other industries like food or nag or any really auto, like any other industry. So we wanted to let them pick and choose which ones were important to them. But for us, I think, there are a couple of factors. So there's the worker perspective. We know that it's really hard to attract workers, talented, skilled workers in these areas, especially when they kind of have similar compensation or other benefits. So we were thinking, okay, what else could be needed for these workers? Separately, and nature is really good for mental well-being and productivity and so on. The others are on the environmental side, right? I mentioned the flood risk, especially in the areas of Southeast Asia where a lot of our supply chain is. It's always, there's weather events. So learning about how ecosystem services could help mitigate the higher level impacts of some of these weather events is important, because our factories sometimes run 24/7, shipping products, making products. So any sort of disturbance in the factory operations is a big deal.
I just wanted to ask about, I've got a bit of an environmental background, and you've mentioned all there's heaps of different risk indicators. How are we doing the measurement of all of these to get, I guess, what I imagine one of the challenges would be is getting that baseline data and then monitoring it, right?
Yes.
That you can then tweak it later.
Yeah.
So how are you capturing stuff? You got sensors and that sort of thing, or surveyors going out?
So we do it from two aspects. One is the geospatial angle via Tracemark, to understand at a high level, which sites have the biggest hotspots, which have the biggest ecosystem impacts. And then from there, we try to understand what's possible to do at a particular site. And once we figure out a plan, we can then install species monitoring devices that are super low cost and privacy centered, so that way we can understand if species are responding. Because the geospatial data sets don't give you that super granular detail about literally the landscape outside of a factory and what's happening there. So we kind of take the big picture with the geospatial data and kind of narrow down to what can be possible at a site. And then from there, we monitor, after we do any sort of program. We do monitoring actually before and after, so we understand, is it just the same stuff and nothing actually changed, or did we actually see a measurable response to the native landscaping, let's say, that we put at a factory site? And usually we've seen a pretty good response rate from species.
So what are the impacts around that when you're, I guess, what are the motivations around it? You mentioned it's very difficult to get workers in the space, and then you've got probably competing industries which are hiring these really valuable resources. I say resources, but they're people, right? Professionals working in these factories, highly skilled, and competing salaries and that sort of thing you mentioned earlier. How's the improved biodiversity and risk management affecting that?
Yeah, so if you think about some of the workers that are coming to these factory sites, they're coming from rural areas, from agricultural backgrounds. So we were thinking, not only could biodiversity mitigation at a factory site help species and help reduce operational costs, usually you have you use less water and you use less pesticides. You don't have to mow the lawn. You're spending less maintenance hours. So there's actual business operational cost reduction to this. But for the workers themselves, like if you're coming from an agricultural rural background, you're coming to a factory. If you think about it, it's like concrete everywhere. You're stuck there, potentially for a while because you live there. A lot of the workers live in dorms at the factory site. So imagine going from like a rural area with a lot of natural vegetation and so on, a farm, what have you, to a concrete location and being surrounded by things that are not natural. So in that respect, we thought improving the landscaping, bringing back some of the nature like species, letting more birds like sing in the morning, whatever, even though it may not be the primary decider for a worker of like, okay, we're going to work here versus here. I think it would help their well-being, their productivity, to have this space that they can, hang out in after work or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. That's a massive psychological impact.
Yeah. And this is like based on what happens at Google. Like we have a spectacular biodiversity program for our offices, and we as employees benefit because we can go on walks for meetings and whatnot. We love it. And so why not bring that to our supply chain? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful synergy that I think everyone would really want to achieve, which is, the company's making more money. At the end of the day, company needs to make money, right? And in line with that, we're also working with our planet and making sure we're doing the right thing by the planet. And then we've got workers which are much happier because they're more connected to that planet.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
There's also like second order effects. So along with the impacts at the factory site, if you can imagine like you're supporting pollinating species like bees or whatever, the classic example, usually there might be some sort of agricultural area near the factory as well. So you're kind of helping the local farmer and the local community by improving habitat in your factory site. So, and that food might help your workers as well. So you have like all these indirect benefits that tie together.
So what are some examples of how you've started monitoring, you've made a change, I suppose, you decided, okay, so this is our baseline, how can we make that better? You made a change, and then did you able to find an impact at the end, or are we sort of still collecting data?
At the supply chain locations, we're still collecting, but we have over a decade of data at Google campus sites that prove that native landscaping increases the variety and population size of species. We know that it positively impacts worker well-being, etc. We know that it reduces operational costs.
So we know all these things already.
We know all this stuff
numbers,
from the Google kind of example. So what we did was took the amazing work our office biodiversity team, we call them RUs, we took their incredible work and created a way to scale it for supply chains. So that's essentially what we did. It wasn't like inventing anything brand new. I think the geospatial angle was new because there are a lot more supply chain locations than Google offices, so we needed a way to prioritize and understand the impact for the whole portfolio, but the mitigation piece is definitely built on a lot of data and learnings from what's happened at Google offices.
So what does it mean to have built something that can now be picked up and used by all sorts of companies all around the world in any industry, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's been such an amazing journey. As I mentioned, like I didn't know much about this when I was starting out. And as we were doing the research and sending ecologists out to the site, I was like, oh, all they're going to find is rats and cockroaches. Like there's going to be nothing there because in my mind, like the image of a factory site, it's completely industrial. Like there's nothing that would live.
Yeah, that's what I thought before.
Yeah. But it wasn't true. Like that was so surprising to me. I was like, are you sure? Like, did you guys, is this real? But we did studies at multiple sites and multiple different ecosystems, and across all of them, we were seeing that there was a large variety of species, and these industrial sites could support species. And so, instead of think of an average like landscaping with like a lawn and you're just dealing with the lawn and there's like nothing going on. It's expensive, it takes a lot of water, and it really doesn't have a lot of value. So why not replace it with native landscaping and so on. Reduce costs for your business, help your workers out, help your local community out. It's like a no-brainer. So the more I learned about it, I was like, this is a no-brainer, and we should definitely have the private sector participate in the conservation journey by doing these very simple programs that don't cost a lot of money and implementing it at their sites.
I also imagine in the marine space, you know how we build jetties and oil rigs and stuff like that, and we don't really think of that as something that's helping the environment. But when you look under the jetty, like here in WA, we've got Boston Jetty. It's got an incredible, it's all man-made, but there's an incredible biodiversity of marine life that live on all of that infrastructure.
Yeah.
So I guess it's similar to that. Like we accidentally build these habitats,
Right.
but now you're even actively doing that on land, which is
Exactly.
makes a lot of sense.
And I think as a lot of areas are industrializing, right, a lot of the old manufacturing zones are shifting to new areas. I think it becomes even more important to plan, in a way that you're benefiting your community that you're moving into as well as yourselves, right? So in this way, I don't think a lot of people know what's possible. And that's what I'm most excited about. It's like, not only is this possible, it's easy. You can start now. You can use Tracemark to understand where to go, and then there's a lot of other information to know what to do. So it's
I guess
not hard.
so. That leads into our next question. So if I'm a company and I've heard this podcast and I want to know, how do I get started on this, and what sort of investment might it cost me? Is that something we can give them a little bit of information on?
Yeah, so there's a variety. So it depends on whether, for example, you would want to put your supply chain information into the platform like Tracemark. If you're not comfortable doing that, you can use the API that was just developed like a month ago. It was released, I think. So you can get the same environmental metrics information for your supply chain sites, either through the API or by logging into the platform. And then if you as a company, want to sponsor a license such that your supply chain can access this information for free, you can do that. So I think there's like different types of licenses essentially for the geospatial piece of the puzzle. And then for the other piece, for understanding what's possible to do at the factory site once you've identified which one to focus on, it depends on how much you want to learn. So you can do something as easy as like, I don't want to learn anything, I don't have time to learn anything, I'm just going to do what we call the no regrets actions. So these are actions like you don't have to know anything about the ecology at the site. Like if you, for example, put bird safe film on the windows that help prevent bird collisions, right? That's like, you don't have to know anything about anything. It will definitely
That'll help you already.
Yeah. So we've identified these sorts of no regrets actions that we've published. And this is like for this use case where they don't have time to learn about anything. And so it's like, switch to native landscaping, don't use rodenticide, use a different form of pest control, and try to make sure that you're controlling the water usage and pollution, right? That's like a big portion of ecosystem quality. So there's that sort of no regrets space. But if you want to learn more and you want to do more, then we're trying to build tools that will be free for people to understand. You just plug in your supply chain location and it will spit out like essentially an ecological plan that will say, here's what's possible, here are the species that would benefit, that are important to the local community. Because throughout this whole program, we want to identify things that would be a win-win, not just from an environmental perspective, like it's endangered, but a particular species may not be endangered, but would be important to the local fishing industry, for example. Or it's important for cultural reasons, like a specific kind of beetle might be important for local traditional medicine, for example. So in that respect, this tool that we're building right now isn't released yet, but we're trying to make it very easy, affordable, and scalable for people to understand which species should I focus on, and what are the habitat requirements for those species, and what do I need to do? Like, it's going to help you plan for your particular site. Here's where you can put the bushes, and which bushes to put, and how much it might cost, and what else would you need to add, like a nest box or some logs for insects or whatever. It's all very very easy things that you have to do. It's not going to cost a lot of money, but we
That's
think
great.
it'll
Even
have a huge impact. Yeah.
and if you're planning, I suppose it'd be a fantastic planning tool for a new site
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, and the fun part is you can use it even for your backyard in theory, right? It's like
Oh yeah,
built for any location around the world. So it really, you just plug in like how big your site is essentially.
Yeah.
And then it helps you like figure out a plan. So in theory, you can use it for even your backyard.
Yeah, there's like heaps of people here always will want to look at native just to save water and everything as well.
Exactly.
Same thing, but just on a much larger scale for an industrial site.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd suggest like for a really large site, you know, depending on how big your site is, I'd say if you can have a site that's big enough to handle, let's say, a wildlife corridor, something that would create a path for species to move from one type of ecosystem or habitat to another. If your site is big enough to support that and you can potentially do a lot, I would at that point recommend making sure that a local ecologist kind of reviews your plan and signs off on it.
Certainly.
Yeah, but for an average user and an average type of site, I think the tool we're building will be very helpful to do a lot of the legwork, as it were, to create an ecological plan for that site.
At least start that conversation as well.
Yes, yes.
So apart from the white paper that we've mentioned already, can you talk a little bit more about this biodiversity monitoring manual as well?
That kind of gives an overview of like, here are the types of devices you can use for monitoring at supply chain or wherever. Like you can put it in your backyard too, but it's basically like, here's the types of monitoring devices, here's a manual for how to set them up and deploy them, and they're all meant to be like really affordable and scalable and privacy centered.
How do you collect that data after to put it into Tracemark?
So right now it doesn't go into Tracemark, but basically, for example, the passive acoustic monitor that's really used to understand the bird response, like species response to mitigation taken on site. We intentionally didn't want to have cloud processing because a lot of partners were worried about recordings at the factory site being sent to the cloud and potentially being misused, right? So all of the processing for taking the recording, analyzing it, identifying which birds appeared on the recording, and outputting the list of birds essentially and frequency of response for that particular species, I think that stuff is captured on the USB drive essentially. So every month or something, your local gardener person at the factory site can go take the stick, download the data, and upload it to a spreadsheet. So that's essentially how easy it is. But then these other types of monitoring, like eDNA, for example, where you're taking leaf samples, so it's super easy for your local gardener at the site, gather a bunch of leaves, put it in a bag, and wait for it to get picked up. Or gather a water sample, put it in a container, and somebody will pick it up. But that sort of like DNA analysis is more complicated and more expensive.
Okay, yeah.
We included that. So there's that.
So the passive acoustic monitoring system, so that is a little device that listens out for bird calls and then understands what that bird's call is and gets the species and puts it on the... That is awesome, isn't it?
Yes.
Frogs, bats...
Yeah, and that
Brilliant.
one is using like a Raspberry Pi device, so really, really affordable. And yeah, we just, and as I mentioned, it's privacy centered, so it's not sending anything to the cloud. So really, like we tried to make it as easy to use as possible.
All right, so I guess I've got one last question for you, Aditi. If you could leave our listeners with one thing, idea, one shift in thinking, what would it be?
I think there's a lot of doom and gloom in sustainability narratives, and what I really hope your listeners take away is that there are things you can do even in manufacturing zones. Like if you can imagine like the grayest, like worst manufacturing place you could think of, it can still support a large number of species, and it's surprising. But I think that's what I would encourage people to understand. There's a lot of potential. Species are already there. How can you help them and help your community? There's ways to do it. Ours isn't the only methodology out there. I think they can learn about what's possible and take action. That's the whole point. If everybody does a small action together, we can make a really big difference. And I'd encourage people not to forget that, because it's easy to get caught up in the doom and gloom narrative.
Yeah, that's right. That was amazing, Aditi. All right, and that's a wrap on today's episode of Location Matters. Thank you for joining me, Aditi. We will link to the biodiversity white paper mentioned in today's episode and in the show notes. It's worth a read if you want to go deeper into the methodology. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to Location Matters wherever you get your podcasts. And if you know someone working in sustainability, supply chain, or geospatial technology, please share it with them. Thank you, everybody.
You've been listening to Location Matters, a podcast by NGIS. To find more episodes, visit our website at ngis.com.au.